in the course of the, next week, because we'll bring you the details comprehensively like no other. Let's go to Parliament now, where the Speaker has declared the majority and minority leaders. He says Osei Kyei-Mensah-Bonsu of the NPP is the majority leader. The NDC's Haruna Idrisu is the minority leader. My colleague Joseph Opoku-Gakpo is our parliamentary affairs correspondent, joining me right now with more. Hello, Joseph.
Gifty, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon. It's good to see you. Let's begin with what necessitated, this sort of declaration.
So there was a request from Frank Anodompreh, who is the majority chief whip. Now we can comfortably say that without having to resort to, fresh terminology that we've all been trying to introduce over the last few weeks.
I know, right?
NDC caucus and NPP caucus, blah, blah, blah. So the majority chief whip, that's Frank Anodompreh, made a request to the Speaker. And in the course of the deliberations in the House today, he said that there's been situations where the leader on their side is not being acknowledged with the name that he actually deserves. And for some time now, Alban Bagbin, the Speaker himself, has been referring to the two of them in terms of Osei Kyei-Mensah-Bonsu and Haruna Idrisu as majority leader, minority leader, respectively, and referring to those on his right as the majority and those on his left as the minority. So in the course of deliberations today, when the House was dealing with the approval of the business statement, which spells out what the House will do next week, he drew the Speaker's attention that he would want the appropriate name and designation for the leader on his side. And then, in the course of the conversation, he said that there'd been a well-orchestrated effort on the part of some MPs on the NDC side, including Samuel Okudzeto-Ablakwa and Hassan Suhuyini, to avoid the situation where Kyei-Mensah will be referred to as the majority leader and their side will be referred to as the minority. In response to that, the Speaker reiterated the directive and the ruling he gave earlier that he sees a situation where Fomena MP, who is independent, plus NPP constitute the majority group, and he was emphatic in emphasizing that he didn't use caucus in that description and that he described them as a group, majority group, and then went on to make the point that in conclusion, well, Osei Kyei-Mensah-Bonsu is majority leader and Haruna Idrisu is minority leader.
But what's the difference between the group and the caucus?
And so Speaker Alban Bagbin attempted explaining that a group refers to a particular group of people who have a single agenda, and you can comfortably say they lie on one side or a similar thing defines them. So he gave examples that, for example, we could have regional caucuses in Parliament. We could have Ashanti Regional Caucus. We could have Greater Accra Regional Caucus. He went on to cite another example that we could have a Christian caucus in Parliament by virtue of the fact that all those individuals in that caucus are Christians. We could have the Muslim caucus by virtue of the fact that all of them are Christians. And so taking a cue from that, then his definition, or for that matter, definition of caucus would mean, for example, us having an NPP caucus and us having an NDC caucus, because they are all defined by virtue of the fact that they are NDC members or they are NPP members. But when you go on to add Fomena to NPP, then you can't describe them with something that defines them singularly. In this case, they are not all of the same political stock. So then in that sense, they are no longer caucus, but for that matter, a group. In this case, the NPP parliamentary group plus the independent Fomena, well, just to rephrase that, the NPP parliamentary caucus plus the Fomena MP then becomes the majority group in Parliament.
Interesting. That's pretty technical and might take a little while to sort of grasp.
In fact, to a certain extent, it's just semantics. It's just everyone.
It's the semantics I'm referring to. But I'm referring
playing on words.
Right. I'm referring to the semantics because it then plays a role in how the minority or whoever is not happy with this description perceives what is being said. So let's get to the minority's reaction. How did they take it?
I spoke to Samuel Okudzeto-Ablakwa, who has been very forceful in the conversation that, as far as they are concerned, there is no majority group in the House. His reaction was that the Speaker has ruled everyone would have to abide by the ruling of the Speaker. They are still clear in their minds that when it comes to the representation of the various parties individually, there is no majority, there is no minority, and that they are getting the majority tag because Fomena is actually on their side. So he says they are okay with it, and then went on to make the point that it's about time we focused on more weightier issues than issues having to do with, who constitutes majority and who constitutes minority.
I totally agree with that. We've actually spent quite some time on this matter since the 8th Parliament started already. But was the minority leader around, Haruna Iddrisu himself? Did he comment?
On the floor, he showed virtually no emotion as Speaker Alban Bagbin put out those specific details that he is the minority leader and Kyei-Mensah is the majority leader. And it looks like they've all been clearing their minds on this for quite a while because the Speaker has repeatedly referred to them with those names. For those on the MPP side, they think this is something that was clear right from the beginning. I spoke to the MP from Manswet Dubia who made the argument that it didn't even require the Speaker's ruling today for everyone to be clearing their minds as far as where who lies. And they look forward to still building consensus with the NDC side and getting business done going forward.
I understand there was a press conference.
Yes, so Haruna Iddrisu, the MP for Tamale South, the minority leader, addressed the media briefing outside Parliament as soon after sitting adjourned. And the focus was on the list that's come to Parliament in terms of the ministers who've been appointed by President Akufo-Addo. The Speaker communicated that to Parliament officially earlier in the day and read out the list of all the MPs and referred the list to the Appointment Committee of Parliament. Haruna Iddrisu says they can expect that there will be rigorous scrutiny of those individuals who have been appointed to the various positions going into the next Parliament. He went on to make the point that he thinks this is a recycled list, not very much different. He says at a point in time with how the president had been governing the country over the last 4 years, they were expecting a reshuffle to bring some fresh energy into his administration. They didn't see that. And for him, even with the latest appointment, it's business as usual going forward. And, there have been quite a number of issues. There was the hint by the majority leader, Kyei-Mensah-Bonsu, that they wanted to see a situation where the Appointment Committee would only vet these ministers after there is a reconstitution of the Appointment Committee that has been approved by the House based on the new standing orders. And for Haruna Iddrisu, they are going ahead with the vetting. In fact, when Kyei-Mensah-Bonsu raised that on the floor, the Speaker, Alban Bagbin, eventually ruled that the Appointment Committee currently constituted should go ahead and do the vetting. So Haruna Iddrisu says they are ready to go ahead with that vetting going forward.
Well, so does it mean that this press conference was solely organized to address the list that the House had received?
Precisely. So that's what it was about.
I see.
The leader on the minority side expressing his thoughts on the list that had come out and describing it as a recycled one and indicating that they are ready to go ahead and interrogate it and take the MPs who've been appointed through the necessary vetting processes going forward.
When exactly does the Appointment Committee begin the process?
So we are waiting for that. So what's supposed to happen is that they are supposed to, first of all, meet as a committee to come to a determination on when they are vetting who. Haruna Iddrisu, who is part of the Appointment Committee, made the point that he looks forward to a situation where some ministries like health, finance will be prioritized in the vetting so as quickly as possible they are approved. But what will happen is there has to be that first meeting of the committee to draw up what that timetable will be. And the standing orders of Parliament actually requires that when there is a list of ministers to be vetted, Parliament issues a 14-day notice to members of the public and invite memoranda from individuals who have concerns or have suggestions on how the vetting should go. And it will be on that basis that the necessary vetting will begin. So we know Parliament is the master of its own rules, so they can abridge that and say, we are probably not inviting memorandum, or we are inviting memorandum for the next 2 days. But if they decide to stick to that, the vetting process may only begin after 2 weeks of public inquiry, participation in the process going forward.
Interesting, Joseph. I want to have a bit more of a conversation with you, but we can listen to the minority leader, Haruna Idris. Well, we'll bring that shortly. But Joseph, just walk me through a little bit of what happened in Parliament, where the former MP got to sit in the seat of the Speaker.
And so, in the course of the conversation, the House was actually debating a statement that had been read by the minority leader, Haruna Idris, eulogizing former President Jerry John Rawlings, who died recently and is to be buried soon. And he made a point about how a lot of them had learned from him and looked up to him in politics for several years now. There were contributions to that from MPs on both the majority and minority side. And in the course of that conversation, Speaker Alban Bagbin announced that the second deputy speaker would take the chair, Andrea Mokwesiama, because he'd wanted to get up from the seat, and the first deputy speaker, Osei Kyei-Mensah-Bonsu, was unavailable at the time. So the former MP took the seat and then invited MPs to contribute to that particular statement having to do with Jerry John Rawlings. He was in the seat for well about 45 minutes, and then Speaker Alban Bagbin returned and he handed over to Speaker Alban Bagbin. But that was the first time that the former MP had the opportunity to chair proceedings, even after he was elected to the position on the morning of 7 January 2021.
How did his term go, if I should put it that way? I mean, how was his interaction with the MPs, and how did it differ from what perhaps Parliament knows?
He actually didn't have too much of a tough time, because it was just a solemn conversation about the former President Jerry John Rawlings. But the interesting bit is, most of the times when Professor Michael Quay was Speaker in the 7th Parliament, and he has to get up and he asked either the first deputy, Osei Kyei-Mensah-Bonsu, or the second deputy, then Alban Bagbin, to take over the seat. Usually they conduct business until the end of the day. Funny enough, in the case of Alban Bagbin, when he announced that we're seeing a situation where the former MP was taking over, about 45 minutes later, he returned to steer the affairs in the chair, even up until the House eventually adjourned sitting up until Tuesday at 10 a.m. The House was still unable to deal with the motion having to do with the school fees of tertiary level students, which was actually on the agenda for today, because the indication was that the conversation around Mr. Rawlings' passing had actually dragged for quite a while. So that debate was moved to next week,